everybody in the room put up your hands if you're not here? I hope you all enjoyed lunch, courtesy of Smile Cafe. Thank you very much, Smile Cafe. It was delicious. Okay, so I haven't had a chance yet to introduce my colleague who has been working all the technical aspects on the stage here. And Fable Vision is in partnership here in Scotland with the University of the West of Scotland. And without their help and support, and in particular my colleague Graham Jeffery, we certainly couldn't have managed to organise this event today. So I'm delighted now to hand over to Graham to chair this afternoon's session. Graham.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Liz. The first thing to say is that my great partner in crime and Katarzyna and my former PhD student, Dr. Ben Parry, is having to do this virtually, as in whatever, kind of in this kind of virtual space. And we thought, how can we do this? How can we make this interesting? So we recorded this long conversation at the weekend, hour and 20. And then I spent like hours chopping it down to a tight 27 minutes. So I've got 27 very tight minutes of Dr. Ben's wisdom. So just to introduce Ben in his absence, Ben came to us in 2011 to do a PhD about urban waste spaces, artist interventions in the urban context. And that was on the back of sort of 15, 20 years of practice following his degree here in environmental art at Glasgow School of Art, environmental art being one of the great global crucibles of this kind of socially engaged practice. And if you don't know about the environmental art program at Glasgow School of Art, you should try and find out about it, because it's very important pedagogically, and it's very important in terms of, it's also produced most of those artists from Glasgow that won the Turner Prize. It wasn't the fine art course, it was the environmental art course. Anyway, I don't want to get into the politics of the Glasgow School of Art. I don't work there. Apologies to anyone from GSO who's in the room. And Ben, at the beginning of his PhD, he was that good a PhD student, produced this brilliant book, which if you don't know it, you should definitely read, called Cultural Hijack, Rethinking Intervention. And on the back of a whole series of work that we did following his PhD, we've just produced this other book, Waste Work, The Art of Survival in Dharawal, which Ben and I have co-authored. And I'm not going to go on about that particularly, because he'll mention some of that in his talks. But Ben is one of those kind of rare people who's a sort of very well, he's not that rare, because lots of artists do this. But he does it really, really well. He's a multidisciplinary practitioner. He's a sculptor. He's an environmental artist. He's a curator. He's a writer. He's worked in all sorts of interesting contexts all around the world. And what I invited him to do for us this afternoon, I said, I want you to drop some truth bombs, Ben. I want you to give it hard. I want you to kind of really do something that's going to provoke us. So he's come up with this talk, and we've kind of tried to keep it really crisp. He looks a bit like Max Headroom in some of it, but we're in this digital space, so hey. And for those who don't know who Max Headroom is, you weren't born in the 80s, let's not go there, I'm getting old and fat. Anyway, I'm just going to let you play this, and we won't take questions immediately afterwards because he's not here. But we will obviously come back to some of these points as we conclude at the end of the afternoon. So in his absence, please give a big round of applause to Dr. Ben Parry. Why are we not hearing him? Can we have some sound from that,
I'm
please?
Ben Parry. I'm a visual artist and
let's
reader.
Okay, I'm just going to start that again. See, glitches are part of life. Glitches are everywhere. We're all in the matrix. Here we go.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event, and my apologies, I can't be there in person, so So yes, I'm Ben Parry. I'm a visual artist and reader in art, environment and social practice at Bath Spa University, where I teach on the undergrad and MA. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about, I think, are informed more recently by my role as a teacher and pedagogue, rather than the kind of histories of my own practice, which are very much rooted in social practice, social engaged practice, but also in terms of organizing artist-run spaces, working with climate activists, and so on. So yes, today I thought we would just talk around 5 provocations around how art can approach, tackle, confront the climate crisis. So again, they're sort of provocations for us to think beyond and differently about the role of art in this moment. Yes, provocation number 1 is bringing into being the world we want to create, art in the service of life. So I contend that we don't currently have the right answers because we aren't really asking the right questions. Simply put, we have the theories, we have the technologies, we have the science, but what we don't have in abundance is the political will, and certainly we lack the imagination to imagine alternatives to capitalism. Not because they don't exist, because they are in abundance throughout the world, but because the powerful kind of obscurantism behind the ideology of neoliberalism means that we don't get to learn about them. So then within my own research practice, I'm particularly interested in framing this crisis of the imagination as something that we urgently need to overcome. So on the one hand, there's this kind of overflowing of artistic representations of the climate crisis by artists, curators, creative producers that are sort of currently filling up our galleries and museums and spaces of material and visual culture. And on the other hand, we have this chronic shortage of spaces from which to engage people in other kinds of storytelling. And because we don't lack those spaces, we have this over-reliance on those mediated spaces by the art world to kind of do that job. And I know within the framework of these 2 days that certainly community arts-based practices, social art and socially engaged practices are very much part of what many of the contributors to this event are talking about. And so I'm not going to sort of stress the points of those too much, although I will sort of touch on the kind of 30-year histories of social practice. But it's more to address the failure of the art world to help us imagine these alternatives. And I speak about the art world because that tends to be the dominant space, or dominates the space in which the general public come to understand and value art practices. So it means that the things that art is so good at, which is creating spaces or creating new forms of valuation, so allowing us to find different ways to value things in our own lives or in the world, that I think we'll try and give a few examples in practice itself to give you an indication of what I might be thinking of. Again, I'm going to just show by Susan and Lacey. And so Lacey organized The Roof is on Fire, which was an event on a rooftop, as you can see in this image, where more than 200 people were invited to have conversations in their cars about the things affecting their lifestyles. So in a sense, eavesdropping on unscripted, improvised conversations by these people in the cars on their rooftops. I show this work because it raises the importance of spaces in which to imagine the world differently. So if we understand that we need acts of radical imagination to confront the times that we're in, we also need the tools of radical imagination, and we need the spaces of radical imagination. And from my own experience of running alternative spaces, of setting up situations in which people can come together outside of those conventions of the art world, those spaces of imagination, of possibility, are sorely lacking at the moment, and we need to kind of imagine those. This is an example really of using a rooftop, of how an artist in the histories and conventions, or someone who is influential in the development of social practice, can kind of take these moments to allow people to come into kind of conversations. The project actually went on for nearly 10 years in different forms, and then there was a huge kind of celebration of that work not so long ago. The second work then I want to quickly show you or draw attention to, which seems fitting in this current situation in Scotland. So I was present at the COP21 when the Paris Agreement was signed in Paris, and I was also at the COP27 in Glasgow. But I wanted to highlight a project by Reverend Billy and the Stop Shopping Choir, who did a performance outside the Scottish Ballet to raise awareness about the sponsorship deal with BP. And just to tell a success story that on the back of that event, not more than a week or so later, the Scottish Ballet actually confirmed that they would no longer be sponsored by oil giant BP. So I think the role of climate activism in these moments is very important, and the enabling of climate activism to stop things like Scottish Ballet's sponsorship of BP seemed like important moments to mention, but also to always celebrate victories. The second provocation is demand the impossible, live the unthinkable, stop making capitalism. Demand the impossible obviously is a slight throwback to 68 and the Situationists and the possibility for a general strike, essentially, even within the space of France, kind of stopping capitalism, if only momentarily, for the sort of 4 days a week long it was of that general strike. And we saw that again during COVID, that actually, capitalism can be ceased, and we can find ways around that. Live the unthinkable, again, that's talking back to those ideas of radical imagination. And stop making capitalism, well, that seems to be really at the heart of some of our problems, really. Stop making capitalism, I come back to the art world here because they are deeply entangled in the histories of capitalism, and are also part of its kind of contradictions, in the sense that art is on the one hand able to make the most expensive commodities on the planet that far outstrip some of the most expensive real estate. So a tiny painting versus whole swathes of city development land, or the whole machinery of the art world that on the one hand has to make these artifacts in order that we can enjoy them momentarily in the gallery as a kind of free and open space of aesthetic contemplation. So that contradiction is always there, and it's something for art makers to think about, really. So yeah, demand the impossible. Well, it seems to me that something about a sort of revisiting of the historical avant-garde, say something like the Situationists, the importance of those ideas in terms of disruption, in terms of civil disobedience, or creating of situations, in the case of situationism, was also about if we need to change the way that we live, overhaul all of the things we do in society to stop making capitalism, we need to create different kinds of spaces, as I've said, where that can be possible. And part of the interesting thing about the Situationists was this notion of rethinking whole urban environments and remaking the city so as to make other behaviors possible. So to give I think the work, there's a few works, but I think a work that's interesting to look back on in terms of the importance of humor, again, in this would be Michael Landy's The Breakdown project on Oxford Street, which in a sense was both a comment on the kind of hyper-capitalism of that London consumerism, but also the possibility to absolutely shred and dispossess yourself of all the things that you kind of felt through consumerism, actually, makeup. And I think that the work is also funny because Landy also had a numerous quite expensive artworks that he'd collected through his friends in that kind of Brit art scene, and all those were kind of also sort of shredded. So that notion that it's possible to kind of to stop consuming in a way. So again, that links to Reverend Billy's Stop Shopping Choir. just kind of linking through these kind of interventions there. Provocation 3, stop living with contradiction. This is quite an important one, and something I've been thinking a lot about over several years now, partly through the contradictions that some people close to me seem to live. But the ability to live with contradiction is both something that is deeply human, but also very much a product of capitalism. The histories of racial capitalism, extractivism, colonialism are very much shaped the possibility for us to live with contradiction. So to give a simple example of that, the contradiction being the way that the US can simultaneously fund the weapons to Israel that are destroying the Gaza Strip, whilst at the same time being one of the primary funders of aid going into Gaza to alleviate some of those situations. That contradiction, on the one hand, to be producing the very problem that you're seeking to then aid, that stretches into all forms of life. If we could stop living with contradiction in all forms, that would be one way that we could sort of tackle this problem. So again, we're able to live with these kind of extreme contradictions. We can buy all the products where we know really at the end of all these kind of chains, if we follow the dots at the end of all the things that we tend to consume, involves some form or recent forms of slavery, of colonialism, of brutality, of violence, and of course the production of wastescapes, waste zones, sacrificial people. So we're able to live with these contradictions, and one way to stop making capitalism or move towards that, and indeed to stop, to cut your emissions by 50% by 2030, would be to start to find ways to stop living with those contradictions. Several works by Renzo Martins that begins with "Enjoy Poverty" shed some light on the possibility of capitalism being built on forms of violence and extractivism. And his work takes place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the later work focuses significantly on the palm oil plantations. And the initial work was very much about Martin's own entanglement in those colonial narratives, and interestingly, as an artist, chose to in a sense address his white privilege by actually doing an extraordinarily brave work by going and spending some time in the Democratic Republic of Congo through the film called "Enjoy Poverty," which at some point you may be able to engage with. That work then extends later to the establishment of the Institute for Human Activities, where Martins is able to start to reverse some of the capital flow from the art world back into those sites in which he is kind of working. Renzo set up that space where art courses could take place, training, public talks, presentations, conferences, but also through his own contacts in the art world, allow those Congolese plantation workers to become artists themselves. So that kind of Boycean notion, everyone is an artist, and then take the works that they had made back into exhibitions in New York and so forth, and actually sell those works as very valuable contemporary art works. That money would then go back to the plantation workers, and it enabled them to actually begin to buy back the land, the plantations from the Unilever plantation owners themselves. So, yeah. Here's some resources to look more into that project, and you can find out a bit more about it also because Martins will be representing the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League will be representing the Netherlands in the Venice Biennale at the moment. Another project that highlights some of the similar issues to Renzo in a very, very different way, and another form of extractivism, which is the role of shells oil extraction in the Niger Delta. This is a work by Zina Sarawiwa. This work dates back to 2015, and all the work marks the kind of environmental and ecological devastation of the Niger Delta wrought by shells leaking pipelines, and the whole history of shells kind of oil extraction in that part of the world, which is by now one of the most polluted places on Earth. She includes the kind of drone footage and a panoramic of the oil spills across the Ogoniland. And then she's also from there and works with the kind of ritual dance of the Ogoni people, which is performed by this kind of traditional masquerade figures of the Karipo dancers who are wearing masks and their movements and mimicking the antelopes, as you can see here in the pictures. And they kind of dance among the kind of decommissioned pipelines that cut across their ancestral lands. Provocation number 4, untangle our toxic entanglements. I want to talk about that partly because it touches on recent work at the Compound 13 lab in India, in Jarvie. Again, this is linked to the previous provocations in terms of to stop making capitalism, but to stop living with contradiction. And so if we were to untangle those entanglements relating to toxicity, pollution, we would be able to find many of the root causes of those situations. So Compound 13 lab in Jarvie, Mumbai has been dealing specifically with plastic pollution, or the plastic pollution crisis, through the creation of a kind of community arts space and experimental learning space, working with young people whose parents and families are involved in the informal plastic recycling industry in Mumbai. So typically that takes place in the very center of the city in one of the largest kind of informal settlements that is Jarvie, where up until very recently 80% of the city's hard waste would go through this kind of hub of recycling plastic processing. And our project was kind of working with the people who are very much at the front line of handling kind of waste, so essentially waste pickers and recyclers, as well as all those dealing with the plastic waste flows themselves. And so we worked with the young people to provide a space in which they could talk about the conditions and situations of their own lives, really, and it all methods of kind of coming to know some of their struggles and situations, and use kind of art and creative practice as a way to storytell and open up about those sort of situations. So Untangle, our toxic entanglement, was a way, that project very much kind of mapped those toxic entanglements and waste flows. So part of that work is also kind of really unpicking those toxic waste flows around the world, looking at plastic pollution in the oceans and so forth, and how that work continues through to how art might also be used in a kind of multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary process. So obviously we're working with social scientists, we're working with citizen scientists, we're working with different people on the ground to tackle the multidimensionality of some of these kind of problems. So another example of how art can help us see through and into those toxic entanglements would be much of the work by Ursula Beeman, who's essentially an essay filmmaker. One of her works, Deep Weather from 2013, connects the world's largest industrial project with rising planetary sea levels and extreme weather events. So the short film narrates the kind of devastating impact of oil extraction of the Athabasca tar sands, which have devastated some of the vast boreal forests of North Canada, and juxtaposing that with the rising sea levels in Bangladesh. So at the same time, the film basically shows the incredible ingenuity of climate adaptation, in which people as infrastructure are basically creating their own flood defenses using kind of sandbags, so actually building entire roads made of sand across these wetlands and flooded plains. So you have that juxtaposed with this kind of the consequent expulsion of First Nation peoples from their ancestral lands through the tar sands, and then just connecting the dots and looking at those kind of nearly permanently flooded zones in Bangladesh. Number 5, creating spaces of, for, and through radical imagination. So, tracing back from some of the earlier things that have been said. You know, how do we build enduring forms of opposition to capital? How do we deal with those kind of contradictions, that given that capitalism is a total chaos of contradiction? And obviously part of that is we need to create frameworks for our refusal, or to enact those kind of acts of radical imagination. So creating spaces seems, for me at least, the heart of how we need to go about doing that. As I mentioned earlier, there's a chronic shortage of spaces to come together, to be together, to talk together, to build solidarity, to build new communities of practice. I talk about this a lot with my students, and when we try to imagine these alternative communities, it's actually incredibly difficult to do it. And it takes a lot of talking, it takes a lot of conversation, it takes a lot of time for people to, you know, to talk about their own anxiety, to talk about their own fears, to talk about their own entanglements, to acknowledge those, to also find power and agency, as well as coming to terms, you know, with our kind of complicity. But the root of that is to have those spaces where we can come together and talk freely. We're free of the commoditization of those social relations, which we understand very powerfully takes place in the so-called social media, you know, understanding the social and social media. And that those spaces aren't really sufficient, and we need to come together. And so I think it's really important to forge those spaces within communities. The huge possibility for art is that has historically done that, is to provide these alternative spaces and to make them happen. And artists historically have been used to doing that. And of course, we know the histories of how those spaces become embroiled in the kind of legacies of gentrification. They enact gentrification not themselves. And we know those situations. So creating spaces for radical imagination really is something that's kind of, it's primary if we're to find ways to confront climate crisis. I want to give an example of a work in Liverpool on the 10th Liverpool Biennale. The artist Mohammed Barisa created a community garden, which on the face of it seemed like, again, a kind of plant project. But significantly, the garden was based on a whole set of approaches to growing and gardening by a patient of the psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon. So during the period that Fanon, in the 50s, the few years that he was at the Builder Joinville Psychiatric Hospital, he took a very particular, interesting approach to occupational therapy through gardening, and reflected the kind of organization, if you like, of his own sort of trauma and mental space in the structuring of this garden. And so Mohammed sort of has taken the kind of learning and particular approach of that patient, of course, under the legacy of Fanon, into this kind of unfinished Algerian herbarium from the 1950s. And so I think that's kind of a beautiful example, again, of a way of kind of weaving in these complex narratives of colonialism and other things that we've been talking about into works that are really about empowerment and enabling people into new spaces of coming together. So to just recap on those 5 provocations: 1, bringing into being the world we want to create, art in the service of life. 2, demand the impossible, live the unthinkable, stop making capitalism. 3, stop living with contradiction. 4, untangle our toxic entanglements. And 5, creating spaces for and through radical imagination. Now, it's probably fair to say that they seem like unreasonable demands of art, or that perhaps I, as an artist, ask too much of art. And so there are questions around, is that even the responsibility of art? What can art do in the kind of face of these struggles? So those provocations are openings, if thinking how we build communities of practice together and how we generate those spaces. So demand the possible, I think, is a good demand. And of course, we have to live the unthinkable. We are already living the unthinkable, but I mean that by living the unthinkable of the possibilities of alternatives, to imagine the world we want to bring into being, and then kind of make that happen. There are many aspects of Gramsci that I've kind of been revisiting, but one was his notion of the interregnum, which is the space in which the old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born. And I think we're definitely in the interregnum. We are therefore needing to create those kind of spaces in between, to use John Holloway's notion of the cracks, of breaking open the cracks. And really, to go back to what I said in the beginning, finding ways to ask the right questions. So I think we could touch briefly to wrap up on the Zapatista's notion of caminar preguntando, which means to walk by asking questions. And that means that the journey of struggle and its encounters along the way shape the questions that we need to ask. So rather than coming to struggle with a very determined outcome, as in the history of revolutionary practice, we try to open that up to say that those spaces of imagination along the way can help shape the questions. We ask the questions while walking as we kind of discover them together. So it's a kind of, it's a journey we need to go on that links together the whole histories of radical imagination across the world, from the Paris Commune to Occupy, and that we see these things as the process, not as a series of finite movements that failed along the way, but we understand them as a kind of process and a journey that we're on, so that we can draw on them and build new spaces along the way. So just to bring that full circle to point one where I started, art in the service of life. Alan Capro, who was one of the great challenges of the art-life boundary, and that notion of art in the service of change, or art in the service of revolution, was insistent that we think of art as living attentively to the world around us, so that we would be very attentive to life and our own life rhythms. And that those were really kind of crucial to the survival of art, through the possibility that art might serve self-knowledge, so that we might learn through the act of making and coming into contact with art. And he wagered that there may be a day when we see, he wrote, the overall meaning of art change profoundly, from being an end to being a means, and from holding out a promise of perfection in some other realm to demonstrating a way of living meaningfully in this one. So yeah, again, just thinking that the living meaningfully in this one means art in the service of life, not art in the service of capital.
So rather than asking questions into the void, hold your questions and thoughts, and we will return to them later. Could I get the panelists for the next session up on the stage, please? Please have a seat. Just have a moment, because I'm going to take me a minute just to pull up all the PowerPoints for this next bit. So many of them. This is going to take a moment, so please relax, talk, sing a song. I need to find the drive file again, so I've got to go back into the drive to get all these.
Sorry, just to make an advertisement. In the meantime, I brought some brochures of the Vienna water supply. I will put it there, so if anyone is interested, just take it.
I found them. Yeah. Okay. So I have to bring them up one by one. I've got an amazing panel here. It's an exciting panel. Are we all here? Yeah, we're all here. Where do I begin? The reason for this panel was everybody on this panel is a kind of expert in what you might call intermediation. They're all people that have to negotiate all of these agendas across all of their situations and circumstances. And what I really want to try and get into here is this business of how you do that, because that's really the difficulty. It's not just about the what, it's about the how, and it's about all that negotiation with power, powerful interests, policy, people that are a bit stuck, institutions that are a bit stuck, how you kind of get stuff happening and how you make stuff happen. And they all do that in their own ways. But I also want to. Where's Karen? Is Karen here? Karen Ridgeway. She was here. Oh, you're hi. It's because you're not wearing your terracotta thing. So, but I also want to start. And like the person that's closest, in one sense, to power. Well, they're all. We'll talk a bit about power. But I want to start with Karen Ridgeway from Creative Scotland, who's going to talk a bit about her own work as a climate person at Creative Scotland. Let me just pull up your Karen Ridgeway's PowerPoint. Hooray, opening the file. This is always, we don't have a PowerPoint wrangler, and I have to do two things at once here. And I'll get her to start us off, but we'll just try and go through this quite quickly and then get a conversation going. Why is this not opening? Sorry to everybody who's waiting for this to work. Try downloading it. There we are. It's all yours. Do you want to come up here and do it? Yeah.
Thanks, Graham. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure I feel comfortable coming behind what Ben's just talked about, but I'm really grateful that you've invited me to join you today. I have been invited specifically to talk about the role of a funder that is working to respond to the causes and the impacts of climate change. I will touch briefly on my role as a climate emergency and sustainability lead, a new and made-up title, at Creative Scotland, and the work that I have joined the organisation to deliver in terms of what we are trying to achieve, what plans we have in place, and what we're looking from those that we fund or work in partnership with. I'm not one for making assumptions, so just in case any of you aren't familiar with Creative Scotland and its purpose, we are a public body that supports the arts, screen and creative industries across Scotland on behalf of those who live, work or visit here. Through the distribution of funding, both from the Scottish Government and the National Lottery, we aim to enable people and organisations to work in and experience what the sectors have to offer by helping others to develop great ideas and bring them to life. As an advocate, we aim to promote the understanding, appreciation and enjoyment of arts and culture and encourage as many people as possible to access and participate in them. We work in partnership with government, local authorities, the wider public, private and voluntary sectors, and our passionate staff use their knowledge and experience, as well as funding, to support creative development across Scotland. Before going into more detail about what Creative Scotland is working towards, I want to give you a little context about my role. I joined Creative Scotland on a secondment last January and have been a member of permanent staff for just over 6 months. The Climate Emergency and Sustainability Lead is a new dedicated post, and its creation builds on the work that was begun several years ago, with staff taking on the responsibility for environmental sustainability as well as their existing roles, and also working in partnership with Ben & Co, who you met earlier, at Creative Carbon Scotland. The new post exists to predominantly aid with the transformation of our organisational behaviours and to work in partnership with others to promote the need for us to embrace mitigation, adaptation and resilience. Over the last year, I've been observing and spending time with the systems that support the arts, screen and creative industries, soaking up facts, learning about our history, paying attention to the value that's already there. We've been untangling the web of connections and working to reduce our impact while also supporting all Creative Scotland staff to become climate emergency and sustainability leads. For us all to adapt and prioritise a consciousness about the impact of our operations on our planetary systems. So as a public body, we have a statutory obligation to contribute to the achievement of the intent of Scotland's climate-related policy. And I'm smiling because it's been quite a hectic week. The Climate Change Scotland Act is still a piece of legally binding legislation. And while there is often focus on the achievement of net zero by 2045, there is a huge change needed in our systems and behaviours running up to that date. But it's not only mitigation policy that is shaping our work. The Scottish National Adaptation Plan, Just Transition Plans and Climate Change Plans are a few examples of existing and incoming policies associated with climate that not only impact us as an organisation, but also those we support. It is manifesting within our own governance in a number of ways. In 2021, our strategic framework, which guides our work, was updated to articulate not only our broader aims, but our priorities, one of which is environmental sustainability. The framework not only introduces the priorities, but outlines their role in our future funding activity, which I'll come back to in a moment. Prior to my appointment, our internal green team was supported by Creative Carbon Scotland and Adaptation Scotland to engage with staff and stakeholders to create our climate emergency and sustainability plan. They compiled over 60 actions attributed to mitigation, adaptation and resilience across many scales of action, from our own operations to those we fund, our partners and stakeholders in the sector in general. The plan facilitates the business case for the allocation of resources across the organisation across 3 timescales: short, medium and longer term, including the creation of the role that I currently fill. After I joined, I was not only able to review the plan and identify which teams across the organisations are jointly accountable for the delivery of change, but also begin to facilitate conversations within our annual planning process to identify the opportunities for us to work together on mitigation and adaptation. We've recently completed the planning for 24 and 25, and there's already really good evidence that the focus on the plan's desired outcomes is impacting my colleagues' approach to project planning. I have hugely benefited from the work that was undertaken prior to my arrival. The co-design plan is a reflection of both staff and the stakeholders' desires for change. It has meant that I have entered a scenario where colleagues are across all levels of the organisation have acknowledged that incremental change, focusing on mitigation, is not enough, and that the transformational system change that leads to resilience is necessary. Oh, that's not my slide. Okay, I don't have long left, so I just want to quickly share some tangible examples of how the strategic priority and plan are shaping our work. One is our commitment to aim for net zero by 2030. We, in our organisation, have a clear articulation of what that means for us and the emissions within our defined boundary that we are working to reduce prior to insetting of any residual emissions on a project within Scotland for public good. As we lease our office spaces, and we know that our largest generator of emissions is travel, we've agreed on emissions boundaries that extend beyond Scope 1 and 2 emissions and the emissions associated with our energy consumption. We report on this annually to the Scottish Government, and as more detailed data becomes available, our emissions boundary will evolve to incorporate even more, such as those from procurement and our digital footprint. As a consequence of that work, we have increased knowledge of not only the impact of our organisational transport emissions, but that of the sector. I'm currently working on a new sustainable transport policy that goes beyond the flipping of the transport hierarchy and looking how to support the sector to better understand and act upon the emissions created by our audiences, as currently only 16 of our regularly funded organisations currently collect and report on their audience emissions. As a funder, our funding criteria can be significantly influential. The timing of my arrival fortuitously afforded the opportunity to contribute to the development of the environmental sustainability funding criteria for our new multi-funded funding framework. This is a significant amount of money, which is competitive funding, which will support core costs and programmes of work for art, screen and creative industries for the coming years. We've introduced 6 themes into the environmental sustainability criteria: mitigation, residual emissions, programme focus, climate justice, a nature-positive economy, and adaptation. Our existing regularly funded organisations have been supported and nudged by Creative Carbon Scotland to become increasingly aware of these themes over the past decade through the environmental reporting that is a condition of our funding and also the ongoing influence of CCS. But for those organisations that have not had funding from us before and might be at the beginning of the development of their net zero pathway or just starting to understand how climate risk impacts their operations, Creative Carbon Scotland have developed and offered starting point sessions and an adaptation learning programme. The multi-year funding process is ongoing, and when it's completed, we'll be able to evaluate the impact of the shift of our funding criteria. The emissions from buildings, along with transport, are the 2 largest emitters of not only the sector, but of Scotland. Knowing this, we recently commissioned Collective Architecture and the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture to carry out research that will allow us to better understand the physical infrastructure of Scotland's arts and screen sector industries. 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2045 have already been built. Therefore, it is vital that we create a collective understanding of the scale and scope of the change required by the estate to even get anywhere close to net zero. The project team are currently reviewing a mounting of existing data, collecting significant amount of new data, and directly engaging with those who own, work in, and make use of the physical estate. We hope that we'll be able to share the outputs of that phase 1 of that project in the summer before moving on to phase 2, which will focus on the mobilisation of actual change. Last one. The final example has been the collective agreement across our leadership team to make what we are doing more visible, both internally and externally. We've agreed to annually review progress of the Climate Emergency and Sustainability Plan to track our mitigation and adaptation actions, reflect on any successes and challenges, and to use the plan to shape the subsequent year's work. This year, we published our first Environmental and Sustainability Annual Review, and it not only includes progress on the plan, but also detailed information on our own organisational emissions and projects that have been funded that align with the environmental sustainability funding criteria. It was only published 3 days ago, so I'd encourage you to take a look and get in touch if you have any questions or reflections. There's only so much you can cover in 10 minutes, but I hope I've provided you enough information to give you an insight into the framework for change that I'm currently working within, and please do feel free to get in contact with me after today's event if there's anything else I can provide you with.
Let's bring Lorna up next. I think I'll introduce you properly, Lorna, in a minute. It'd be interesting to reflect on people's own countries, what your arts funding agencies are doing. Do they have sustainability leads? Do they have climate change people? And Lorna's also in a really interesting role because she's in a sort of climate cross, she'll tell us about it, but she's in a cross local authority climate role. And it's interesting to see, how funders and people, policy-oriented organisations are kind of, bringing this agenda in. Lorna, let me find your presentation. Oh, hey, sorry, I should have. Anyway, it's this one, isn't it? Yeah, let's bring it down. let me... Right. There we go. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. It's been a really interesting day so far. My name's Lorna Jarvie. I'm from South Ayrshire Council, which is one of Scotland's 32 local authorities, for those of you not familiar with Scotland so much. We are southwest of Glasgow on the coast. The question that I was posed before I came along today was, what does best practice in partnership working for climate goals look, sound and feel like? So I thought of a few examples, drops in the ocean as it were, according to the analogy from this morning, and I'll talk to you about a few of them. But in terms of the general thoughts I had on that, for me, it's about speaking the same language. It's about shared journey to a shared vision, and it's about everybody wins. So things where everyone is going to be happy with the outcomes, where we can get to that place, where we can achieve that. My role within my own local authority is a little like Karen's within her organisation, where I am going about trying to essentially work across all the parts of the organisation, mainstream good behaviour in terms of sustainability and climate change, reduce emissions, deal with adaptation, make sure there's climate justice mainstream through everything we do. And at the end of the day, unless we achieve that in our local authorities and other public bodies through everything we do, we're not going to get where we need to go. But today I want to just talk about a few specific drops in the ocean that I think are examples of maybe not best practice, but certainly us doing better in terms of our partnership working and getting towards some really positive action. The first I want to speak about is our work in terms of green health in South Ayrshire. This is a bit of a collaboration which has been through the lens of our community planning partnership, so different public bodies coming together. We're required to come together in that way in Scotland. It's a legislative requirement that local authority areas have community planning partnerships. But in terms specifically of this work in green health, this was driven by Nature Scot and our health board colleagues and ourselves at the local authority recognising a need, that there was something to be gained from thinking about green health in particular differently and promoting that. And we came together around about 5 years ago to set out some joint aims and some joint resourcing. And I think that's really important because it's not often that you have different public bodies, different groups coming together and putting not just some imagination and some ideas in the pot, but a little bit of money too, which got things going for us. So our initial piece of work, we created an app where local people could go on and they could find out about green health opportunities. So if there was groups that were doing things like walking, or perhaps they were doing bird watching, or even some forms of art, they could find out about these and go along and get involved in them. And we hope that people like local doctors, GPs, etc. would be able to then recommend this if they had somebody that came in and they thought the thing that this person could benefit from would be a little bit more exposure to nature and connection with nature. And that was good, and it seemed to be successful to some degree. It caught the imagination locally and everybody welcomed it and heralded it. But more recently, we recognised another gap, and there was definitely a group of people out there that found that hard to reach or hard to connect to, because they perhaps weren't going into the doctor's surgery and having that conversation. Perhaps the doctor wasn't in a position to spend the time to take that to them. Perhaps these people didn't actually want to have that kind of group involvement, group engagement. They didn't want to go along to a busy place with other people on a regular basis. So the most recent thing that we've done through that partnership is the Green Health Calendar, and this is the April month of it that you can see here. So we worked together with a local small business called Undersky, which is essentially run by two local mums, one of whom is a former countryside ranger and the other whom is a graphic designer. And they came together to support this work with the NHS ourselves, Nature Scot, and put this together. So we have within this promotion of local places where people can go to experience nature. We had this notion of the Doorstep Nature Challenge, where people could actually very much do something in their own house even, don't even need to leave their house, sometimes in their local street, that sort of thing. And we had something for children, but we also within that had some new ideas like the word of the month, so just getting people thinking and talking differently. And that's gained a little bit of traction. You can see that project evolve on our South Ayrshire Rangers page. And I think it's been really positive because we now have some imaginative ideas involving different partners coming together where people are starting to talk the same language.
Connection lost. Ingen donut hat. Ich hab da nicht hingegriffen.
As Alison has
Ich hab da
made
nicht
it very
hingegriffen.
clear here, humans are codependent.
Nur hier.
Our happiness and health depends on our connections and relationships that enable us to thrive.
Hat vielleicht der von der Ferne oder was?
Our social, emotional, and physical environments, and climate change is having an impact on that. Alison tells me during our green space and biodiversity working group meetings that patients, people in communities have climate anxiety, and these are real. And so I think this small project, another drop in the ocean, the Shields Centre in Pollokshields, is doing something to challenge this in its local community. Is it the top one? Which one is it? Oh, right. Yeah, thank you. So this project started, I think, in around 2013, where it was a new build project. It's a small health and care centre. They decided quite quickly not to call it a health centre. They call it the Shields Centre. We have successfully in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, due to my role being brought in 2005, argued for a % for art in all our capital projects. So we had some money sitting inside the Build project to bring an artist, Alexander Hamilton, who is a great expert on biophilic design, into the project, the only artist on the project, and Urban Roots to work on the garden. And Alexander went out and ran lots of community engagement projects with local residents, looking at the garden designs in the area, looking at the flora and fauna, to influence the design of fins along the Corten fins along the front of the build. These offer shade and interest and identity to the building. Urban Roots came in for 2 years with money from the health improvement team, £22,000. Alex had £24,000. That was for fee, for production, design, everything, laser cutting of the fins. For the garden project, Urban Roots were really interesting. A few people did tender for this project. They were really good on prescribing gardening, quite knowledgeable about growing things in communities, and they took on the first 2 years, and subsequently the health improvement team funded them to keep going on this project. And they've developed an absolutely beautiful garden and oasis locally in the Shields Centre, and it's ongoing today. So they do one-to-one gardening sessions. The GPs refer patients to the gardening projects, responding to stress and distress through connection with nature. It's a whole family approach, connecting communities with nature, growing food, painting and drawing in the garden. The garden and the Shields Centre is a community venue, and when it opened, there was lots of local cooking going on. It is a health centre and what I would call a healthy living centre. The concept of healthy living centre started with the Bromley by Bow project in East London years ago, and it was replicated with government money, but I don't think I've ever really seen a proper one. I think this one is emerging as one. It's growing out of real need and real connection. So activity, seasonal growing, foraging, and of course cooking from soil to plate. So these are some of the quotes from people who are involved in the project. So with the seasons changing and watching the garden evolve, knowing that I have a role to play in keeping it healthy and beautiful makes me feel like I'm part of something. I've met people through the garden who are very different from me, that I never would have met otherwise. I feel that this place helps me to break my social bubble.
It creates important connections for me, which help me keep healthy and happy. I've also learned skills that are useful in other parts of my life that I can share with other people. It's like a strong circle of positivity, which starts at the garden and keeps growing wider. I am so grateful for the circle and to be part of it. And this is coming from Urban Roots and the Health and Social Care Partnership. Health and wellbeing, we know health improvement teams. I'm situated within public health improvement. For years, health improvement will do anything that creates protective factors for the population. And urban green spaces, providing spaces for sanctuary and healing, skills development and employability, and that's community wealth building, is one of those things. And as we know, populations which are exposed to greener environments also enjoy lower levels of income-related health inequality. Environments which promote good health may be key in the fight to reduce health inequalities, create sustainable humans. So I just want to show you very quickly a few slides about some of the other projects across Glasgow that we've been doing in collaboration with artists and green space. Recently, we've enhanced the green disused pond at the back of the Royal Alexandra Hospital, created a new exhibition area, provided seating, and put a mural on the back of the chaplaincy, especially for the intensive care unit who had an absolutely dreadful view. And we've based it on the local planting of the area. And this is educating, helps the hospital community understand about the local flora and fauna, and it's opened up respite space for staff and new wildlife to return to the pond. This began many years ago. Soon after I started my job in 2009, the first two projects we worked on in the city was the new Stobhill Hill and Victoria Hospital, and the challenge was to develop an art strategy within those two hospitals. At the time, we had a community engagement officer, his name Mark McAllister. Before he joined the NHS, he'd done urban planning degree, and we seemed to get on quite well. And he decided to go and talk to the local authority about the park across the road, about pulling down the fence and opening up the park as a waiting room in the park. And we achieved this with the local authority, with money from Creative Scotland and land services, and opened up the park with a beautiful moon gate from the artist Alec Finlay. Bird boxes were put into the park and poetry stones to encourage people to engage with the park, to wait in the park. It's a diagnostic hospital, so you don't stay there overnight, but you can, the process of understanding what may be wrong, diagnosis and treatments all happen in one day, so people can be there for quite a long time. These are our health centre projects, and in the top right, that one over there, left, right, I can't, wrong way around. Yeah, that's the shield screen that the artist Alexander Hamilton developed with local community residents. And a tree was removed from the Barhead Health Centre, so we had a tree sculpture designed. The curator there was, Patricia Fleming, and it was such a long time ago, this one. And recently, a labyrinth walk has gone into the Clyde Bank Health Centre to encourage meditative walking during lunch break and for local residents. The courtyard's open. And as well as that, encouraging activity. So there's room for the skateboarders and the BMX bikers on installations by the artist Jim Buchanan that's gone outside of that building. These have actually been funded by the Green Exercise Partnership. In mental health, thanks to Creative Scotland, we had funding to support an artist to work with our landscape architects on the first phase of revamping the Levendale Hospital. So the artist Lindsay Perth was involved in that project, and she dedicated her life to working with patients during the pandemic, created new seating, and with the architects and the mental health occupational therapists, there's been wildlife planting, raised beds, a new mural to animate that space. And patients have already said it's completely improved their relationships with each other and the staff. And again, a small drop in the ocean, but something that's very meaningful for that space and for the people who work and live in it. And then lastly, I just want to talk about a project which took 6 years and began with 3 health centres in the north of the city: the new Woodside Health Centre, the new Mary Hill Health Centre, Health and Care Centre, and Possil. And in the midst of all that, Scottish canals and a massive green amenity. And when we began the Woodside Health and Care Centre project, where you can see these serpentine walks, it was just a bank of bracken. But beyond that bracken was the beautiful Scottish Canal. And so our health improvement team were chairing the Arts and Environment Strategy Group. And I think I forgot to say, every capital project, we always set up an Arts and Environment Strategy Group. And they were very keen to work out how we could get up onto the canal and join the health centres together. And a charrette with Scottish Canals. We on our group, we had the local housing association, land services, Scottish Canals, local residents. So this was the collaborative partnership that began in the health centre, but then we moved across to the Scottish Canal offices and met there. And we had Green Exercise Partnership on board again. We had money from them as well. And in the end, our money went across the road to Scottish Canals. And I think Tim is still here in the audience, phoned me up, I think it was on a Friday, and said there's some money available. And I can't even remember the organisation you were representing. He said, we've got £1,000 and we need to spend it very quickly. And I remember working with Jill McLennan from Scottish Canals. She had no idea how to write an artist brief, and we, over a weekend, wrote a brief to get an artist to engage with the landscape architects who Scottish Canals had appointed to actually get some ideas for this Garscube link and opening up the Garscube link. And Stephen Hurrell tells me, which I'm very proud of, is that he thought of the slide. And there are many ways you can get up and down now. There's no bracken, there's a serpentine walk, it's really accessible. With all these projects, we get moved on to the next one. And some of the artists who we'd worked with stayed behind and they went and worked with Scottish Canals. And Siobhan Healy, glass artist, who'd been on the project researching the flora and fauna of the area to inspire the artwork for the new health centre, the butterflies and moths and the clay pits. She was a friend, had grown up knowing the late Alistair Gray, the poet late Alistair Gray, and her connection with Alistair Gray and her visits to Alistair Gray, she gathered poems, some of which are in the health centre, and then they appeared on these stepping stones. I didn't even know this was happening. And so I was delighted to see this. Once it was unveiled post-pandemic. I think the project may have been held up during the pandemic. So I think this has really opened up an enormous green amenity in the city. It's opened up the opportunity for people in the north of the city not to have to take public transport, but to walk across the green space, down the avenues into the city of Glasgow, and for people to have picnics and enjoy the space, go jogging along the canal, fishing, canoeing, whatever. It really is a new asset for the city. I'm going to finish on that slide then. And just to say, these are circular projects where our artists are often involved in growing projects as well. And this is one from the early days, and we still stick with this philosophy.
I'm going to bring up Vinishree next, if I can find her presentation. Oh, am I done with it? Oh, okay. There it is. Over to you.
Thank you, Graham. Hello, everyone, and thanks for sitting around for this long. I'm Vinishree. Am I too close to the mic? Is this fine? Perfect. Thank you. I'm Vinishree, and I am a multidisciplinary designer and a creative practitioner. And the project that I'm going to share with you today is called Cultivate. It placed creativity at the heart of climate justice and has developed actions with local communities across the Tay region in Scotland. The project was led by Creative Dundee and funded by, again, Creative Scotland's Culture Collective. In the center, you can see it with the blue highlight, that's me. So my brief was to work with people from diverse ethnic communities in Dundee, but alongside me, there were many amazing creative practitioners who worked in surrounding areas like Angus and Perth, and worked with other groups like young adults and people from low income. So, as a creative practitioner, I developed a climate justice framework for this project and designed creative tools to engage with this intergenerational group of women and children. Climate justice conversations can be, as you're aware, can be very vast, complex, and tricky at times. So what I did was first broke down those overwhelming concepts into simple, digestible formats, finding examples from everyday life. And everyday life. Yeah. So, and throughout the project, I used co-design methodologies to engage with this group. Co-design is something that comes with my education in service design and my background. So the idea was to do things together. How can we together work and find gaps in the climate narrative? How can we together frame the response to climate justice? Also, because of my background in product design and circular economy, I specifically selected the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, that is responsible consumption and production. It led me to explore various themes like capitalism, which was mentioned a couple of times. So, how capitalism is deep rooted in our buying cultures and our everyday lives. We also explored themes like greenwashing and the role of producers and manufacturers. We discussed circular economy, linear economy, donut economic concepts, and I'm lost now. During these workshops, I heard diverse voices, experiences, and actions. The stories shared within the group range from what my grandmom did to what my children are doing. So, stories ranging through generations. People shared about their cultural differences, lifestyle changes that has happened over time. Food was like a universal language in my workshops. So food was something that was constant, and people kept sharing about different food cultures. We also spoke about waste and how we tackle waste in our households. We spoke about upcycling. We spoke about plastic and how dependent and embedded it is in our lifestyle. So one thing that emerged out of our workshops was how language in the climate sector is slightly inaccessible and is not meant for all. So, and we together as a collective need to do something about it. Conversations on power and privilege were also quite prominent in our workshops. We discussed various kinds of inequalities, especially those faced by women and children coming from diverse ethnic backgrounds. We also discussed unequal distribution of wealth across the world, global north-south cultural differences as well as disparities, which finally eventually contribute to the carbon contribution of global north and south. Okay. Another thing that emerged, and it reinstated the stark truth of how intertwined the social and environmental issues are, and how can we consider intersectionality in relation to ecology. Throughout the project, my core idea revolved around reimagining tomorrow. How might we collectively start thinking in the long term? How can we be more speculative in our actions and start thinking of the future generations? So generally as a family or as a community or even as a single human, we tend to foresee future in the next 10 years or 15 years. How can we extend it further? How can we think about 30 years from now or more? So for reimagining that tomorrow, we needed people to not only understand the various nuances of climate change, but also embed those small changes, small actions in their day-to-day living. So in this slide, I've put together pictures of particularly those women who embraced that journey and really embodied the role of climate champions, amplifying the climate justice voice in their community, in their workplaces, even as their social positioning, and also within their families. The project culminated in this brilliant and beautiful exhibition called Dear Earth. It was led by, designed by, produced by this group that came together, definitely supported by me and the organizations. But what it did was give representation to people who usually feel unrepresented. So this group felt really empowered, they felt heard, and appreciated. That was important. It also gave them the opportunity to showcase their creativity, their ideas, and also through the exhibition, raise questions and also awareness to the wider community for further future making. The impact of a project I usually measure by, how many lives and families it has touched. But I was, towards the end, happy that how this group emerged as climate champions, and they championed climate action in the city of Dundee. And I'm ever so grateful to have worked with this extraordinary group of humans. They're coming from 15 different countries and cultures, as well as from Scotland. And in the process, I realized that I myself, as a designer, I had evolved and grown in the process. So that's me. And in terms of best practices, I would like to just share that there is a need for making our approaches more inclusive and embedding accessibility in all climate work. How can we not only introduce who are marginalized, but also think of the barriers that people face to engage with any project? How can we break those barriers and be more accessible in our approaches? That's me. Thank you.
We're going to completely fail to have a conversation because we're running so chronically out of time. So I hope you can see that there's a thread that connects. I'm trying to find your presentation on my thing. There we are. I hope you can see that there is a thread that connects all of these people's work, because I'm not sure we're going to have very much time to interrogate it. But anyway, this is Samuel from New Practice, and I'm going to get him to talk about his work. View. This has to be very fast. There we go.
All right, hi everyone. I'm going to move this up a bit.
Just keep going.
Okay. So I'm replacing our creative director who was meant to be here today. So I'm from New Practice. We're an architecture firm in Glasgow. We try and, as you can see here on this list, go beyond architecture, think about new ways of doing ideas, connections, experience, thinking, collaboration, and then partnerships. So at the core of what we do, we have our architectural work, but within that, we also do a lot of community engagement. So across the different sectors we have, whether it's private development, local authority, or directly with community groups, we really try and center community in the middle of what we're doing. So just to kind of, if you were to Google us, this would probably be the top thing that would come up. Our work develops the creative capacity of places and connects people with the decision-making processes that underpin their lived experience. That's us. Key thing with us that we always like to say is we're a women and LGBT-led practice, which is quite a unique, almost political statement to make in architecture, which is typically quite a bunch of old white men sitting at the top of the room. So, the project I'm going to talk about is called Custom House Key. I'm really quickly going to try and whiz through it. So it was with GCC, we did the community engagement on this work. Hawkins Brown was the architect, and it's really about trying to repair the quay wall of the Clyde. Needs urgent repairs done to it. But how can we bring the city into that? How can we kind of think about other ways to engage with that space along the waterfront, which I'm sure we'd all agree is a pretty critically lacking space in Glasgow with a lot of potential. So within this consultation, we obviously did like the big online survey, those traditional ways to just engage with the rest of the city. But a really important thing for our work is how do you engage with underheard voices? It's not just about equality in engagement, it's about equity. If you want to go with an equal approach, you will get, you won't kind of address people's means of access to engage in the consultation. You'll still hear the loudest voices that exist in society. So you almost have to go out of your way to have an equitable approach and bring people into it who aren't otherwise going to be heard. So one key one for this project was youth. So a key thing with youth engagement is trying to incentivize them. How do you get them along? How do you teach them a skill, do something fun? So we worked with Skate of Mind here, who was they're a charity who essentially work well-being through skate with kids. So we brought them on, we did skating in the area, but that was really to try and hear from them, how do you think you could use this space? What other kind of urban ways of engagement could be exciting about the river, which is already kind of happening in there? What are the stories we're trying to get out of that? And then that kind of moved on to, you can see on the left there, graffiti. Graffiti is a really key part of that part of the city. And typically with graffiti, it's not something that we want to try and cover up. We want to try and understand why it's there. What's the kind of sense of ownership and agency that's potentially tied to wider social concerns around that area? So we did a kind of graffiti workshop with kids, trying to work with Glasgow identity, sustainability, the water, and did a kind of mural workshop with them to build that into the process. Another thing we did was boat rides. So we found that a lot of people have actually never been on the Clyde, have never been down to the Clyde, despite living in the city. So we engaged this little boat ride tour to get people on the river, to bring them down to a different eye level, understand the river from a new idea, what could it be? And a really interesting thing about planning that process was the difficulty of engaging with the water, having to hire pontoons, the expensiveness of hiring someone who can actually take you on the river. And that was a really interesting way to understand the agency around engaging with that resource in the city and building that into its future. And then we did some walking tours. So we did one in the day, which was using some artists, the key design team members, and trying to understand some stories that people were seeing, some other ideas around the waterfront. But then a really key one that we did, which is probably not in the final report, is the dusk one that we did. And this was really important because we wanted to acknowledge that the river and the Clydeside area has a really strong identity and use for people who are rough sleeping and also sex workers. And that was a key part of understanding the story of that area, and not necessarily wanting to think about cleansing it, but understanding why is the river used in that way? What are the kind of social stories behind that part of work that could be involved into what its future could be? So we worked with Umbrella, who is a charity that works with sex workers, and then we also worked with the Simon community, who works with rough sleepers and homelessness, took them on a dusk walk and tried to understand these issues around safety and equity and bringing those ideas into the process. And I think that's a really key part about understanding how we could do this work, is that if you want to engage with a wider audience and engage equitably, you have to kind of develop new ways of listening, new ways of kind of doing engagement beyond the kind of typical process of doing door-to-door surveys, online surveys, that kind of thing. But I just finish on the key issue with that is it costs a lot of money. It's a resource. It takes the time. So there needs to be almost systemic changes within the way that we engage this across all levels to really kind of make it something that's at the core of the process that we're doing. So yeah, that's me. Yeah, I'm a senior designer at New Practice. I didn't say that, I don't think. I'm not an architect, so you can't call me that. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Sorry, like the success of this section is also its failure. Like all the projects are so interesting. I didn't want to stop anyone while they were in their flow. But as a result of that, we've completely run out of time. So if you have a question for any of these panelists, you need to grab them in the break, because we're going to have to keep moving because we have online stuff and lots of things to do. But thank you all so much, because so much brilliant work, like just outstanding work. And such a range of stuff, you know, and in a sense, we're just dipping a toe in the water of the richness of diversity of the work. And one of the questions, I think, is how to kind of make all of this more visible and more just like, it's not routine, but just happening all of the time, because this way we are bringing into being those new spaces that Ben was talking about. Anyway, thank you. We now have 10 minutes to grab coffee. You have a choice. You can come upstairs to the club room and listen to some stuff on arts methods and climate, or you could stay in here and listen to a really interesting group of people talking about interdisciplinary research and climate. Thank you. So sorry.